for the second half of the study morning, we're going to begin with a conversation with Maud Cotter and John Carson. Maud and John are both artists, and Maud studied at the Crawford Art Gallery in Cork, where she saw Beuys's performance lecture in 1974, and John studied in Belfast at the Art College there, and again as a student saw Beuys giving a lecture in Belfast. So they're both, we're going to begin, and Maud is joining us from Cork, I think, and John, you're in Pittsburgh, is that right? So we're going to begin with Maud and then John, just to kind of have a brief introduction each to their recollections of seeing Beuys, the impact on their work or the student body, and then we'll go into a conversation. So Maud, I'll hand over to you to start with.
I thought I'd look at and remember the secret block for Secret Person in Ireland, the actual title of Beuys's exhibition or performance or exhibition of drawing. And this is the book, by the way, here, with a beautiful telephone conversation interview by Caroline Tisdall. So this is in my studio because I pestered the principal of the then School of Art, Mr. T.F. Maloney, to give me the one poster that came to Cork. And I've kept that with me. Well, it's interesting that that particular title had a real tension, and it spoke to a number of things for me. One was obviously this notion of a block. There's something that would then kind of manifest itself, that would take over new space, that would intersect in what was already the field of cultural and political endeavour in Ireland at the time. And Beuys's idea that speech is, in fact, a form of sculpture, it makes sense in the fact that he had this kind of embedded spatiality in the title. Now, I was 19 when all this happened. I remember feeling very disturbed a little bit and a bit put out, because I was asking myself, am I the secret person in Ireland? And how many secret people are there in Ireland? And what are we holding? And what is the secret? I mean, I didn't know at the time that the block also referred to the block of drawings, which he did over some 36 years. And that these drawings were the actual genesis and the springboard from which his thinking evolved. So, but nevertheless, I thought I'd show you this poster, which I have in my studio. It reminds me a little bit of the Cork drawing that he did, in the sense that he had something like a head. And I remember the feeling of sheer excitement when he leapt forward and he did a kind of a line that kind of projected out of the head, this idea of somehow a manifestation of intellectual, spiritual energy from the mind into an outer sphere. So, you know, there were so many prompts. Now, I could say at the time as well, I was just in second year. My first year in college had been completely 100% drawing. We were sent out to experiment in the college, and I was C, so I went out first. I found the life drawing class, and I didn't go back to any other class, and nobody came and got me. So I spent a year in life drawing. Sean O'Leary, our lecturer in life drawing, said, drawing doesn't matter what it looks like. It's what you learn. It's this kind of activity. That's what's important. And then we had Catherine Boyd, who came along and taught us through mediums of and kind of exercises of Bauhaus. So if we move on to the drawing, could we have the next image, please? When we encountered, and this was after the lecture, when we encountered Beuys's drawings, I think only about 26 or something came to Cork, a small portion of the drawings, but they were extraordinary pieces because of the modesty of them, because it kind of, to me, kind of formed a contradiction to the great bulk and the great presence of Beuys. And his assertion for me of how I was thinking at the time. So this piece, Stag, is a very beautiful, delicate piece. I particularly like the fact that the watercolor clearly rests in its own way on the paper, and the lines that form this, the very connective and symbolic horns of the stag are at times just pencil there. Could we move on to the next slide image? I'm just kind of fascinated. I remember walking along, my friend Jennifer, revisiting the show again, because of course the College of Art was the Crawford College of Art, was in the Crawford Gallery at the time. So we were in a condition of living with these drawings. And actually after Beuys's lecture, I went back and visited his drawing on the board for some days, pestering the principal to the point at which he just left the theatre open. So I was able to go back in and just spending time with that organic line. And this was, to me, somehow represented an affirmation of the very organic and sort of innate kind of mobility of nature and culture in Ireland, as against something stricter and more formulaic and more advanced that was in a kind of bureaucratic way that was coming from Europe at the time. So there was a real cultural struggle. And we did have as well, like a friend of mine, may she rest in peace, but she was blown up in Dublin that year in 1974. So this had a huge effect on me. I had won the Student of the Year and I was in America for 3 months. So I was actually possibly there when he was doing his piece. I was unaware of him. I was unaware of that performance. And I came back to this gift of this block of drawings. May I move on, please? What were fascinating about Beuys's drawings to me at that time was the fact that they were so lightly themselves, that they were filters, that they allowed paradigms and landscapes and ideas, but there was this kind of feeling of the reality of the drawing, as Beuys said himself, the reality of the drawing is much more real than so-called reality. That was extremely evident. Also, the idea that drawing was thinking in action. This I had learned, and this was a manifestation of it. That it was it lacked such corporate kind of presence as well, that it was so light, a filigree of drawing. It allowed both the past and the present to kind of filter as banks of pressure on the back and the front of the drawing. You know, it became its most minimal self. May I have the next one, please? This beautiful piece is called Some Power Work, and actually it was drawn in the year I was born in 1954. And it's just, you know, it has just the simplicity of landscape, but nevertheless the power of references, of ideas, and the elemental kind of embeddedness of nature and what constitutes physical reality in Beuys's work. So, you know, this is why in the end, over the years, this secret block of drawings, which represented his thoughts initiated through drawing, that came into action in so many ways, beautifully visited by previous speakers, became a real gift, an actual personal gift. May I have the next piece, please? And having missed and not knowing about this while it was happening, while I was in America, it's lovely to look on this. And I particularly like this image of I like America and America likes me, of Beuys because he maintained the gaze with the coyote during the performance, and he's lying in repose. And because it says to me that, you know, Beuys's kind of universal vision came down as well to something very personal, nuanced and observed. And it also, it also sort of speaks to current thinking, the idea that we need to kind of formulate a more cosmic vision in the context of very personal responsibility in our present reality. So that's.
So I'll bring in John Carson now. John, it'd be fantastic to hear your recollections. I think quite different, but and I shouldn't mention as well, Maud and John contributed to a podcast that we made earlier in the year, which you can access through our website or through the Beuys 2021 website. And I had a conversation with Maud, and John had a conversation with the artist Sean Lynch. So if you're kind of wanting to hear more about Maud and John's reflections on Beuys in Ireland, then there's other resources online. But John, I'll hand over to you for now.
1974, when Joseph Beuys came to Belfast, I was first year at the art school in York Street in Belfast. And I was also the editor of the college magazine. So this is the cover of the college magazine. The arrival of Joseph Beuys, or the announced arrival of Joseph Beuys, was greeted with great excitement and great skepticism as well by the students in the art school. It's 1974, and we were at the height of extreme kind of sectarian violence. You know, what was going on outside the walls of that building was really extreme. So what people were responding to was people were excited about the ideas of Beuys, but there was also a kind of skepticism about the cult of personality that surrounded the man, and the kind of messianic kind of aura that was created around him. So the magazine's just picking up on this. Prepare you the way of the Beuys. Is he a Beuys crying in the wilderness? And again, picking up on the messianic quality, I have Beuys here walking on water. He's landing at Carrickfergus on June the 14th, 1960. Some of you may know that King William of Orange landed in Carrickfergus on June the 14th, but that was in 1690. This was another page from the magazine, which again, picking up on the sort of iconic nature of Beuys and the image that he created for himself, always wearing the same outfit. And you might recognize Caroline Tisdale on the right there. She was translating, interpreting, helping. Norman was talking earlier about Beuys's presence being so important, and I think that is the case. He, in a sense, he is his own art. He was his own artwork, or he was part of his own artwork, in the way that you could say about Andy Warhol or Tracy Emin. That personality cult is part of the power and part of the kind of effect of the artwork. So that's what's being picked up on here. And this is a page from an independent magazine in Belfast. And this was kind of a less satirical, more kind of serious. But Beuys is a two-headed beast here. And what this work was this graphic is trying to deal with is the kind of contradictions within the man, and the fact that some people were seeing a charlatan and some people were seeing a savior. Belfast doesn't take too kindly to posers, and so the circus that was surrounding Beuys, was creating a kind of skepticism, especially among the students. I was at the talk at the Art College. I was at the talk at the Ulster Museum, and I found it both talks were very dense, and difficult to penetrate. I had been familiar with Beuys's writings prior to this, and really enjoyed the writings and the ideas that were coming through in the writing. Didn't work the same way for me in performance, especially with sort of language difficulties. And if you see that Derek Bailey video that you mentioned, Logan, you can pick up on some of the difficulties of comprehension. But I just want to read some quotes, from on the top left is my editorial. Beuys's speech bubbles are his own words, and then on front of the desk are the comments that came from different people in Belfast. So I just wanted to read some of those. His implied nullification of the ego contradicts sharply with his own figureheading activities. I'm also sorry, I've got these, the glasses aren't doing the job they should be doing at the moment. Your theories are good, but I don't see how they can be got across to the people of Northern Ireland. And again, that's just picking up on the fact that we were in the throes of extreme violence, and people were seeing his ideas as idealistic, romantic, admirable, but idealistic and romantic and inapplicable in the situation that we were living through in Belfast at the time. And I'd like to thank Amanda for her amazing performance. And I remember that little incident as well with the woman in the street in Belfast. But how I remember it is like over the years, what I thought she said was, God help our wee country. They're coming from everywhere to pick the bones off the carcass. And so that was one attitude. Another comment, a breath of fresh air. He's one well-known artist person who is completely honest and open. So you had conflicting opinions, contrasting opinions. And I must admit myself, I was kind of admiring of the man's ideas, but skeptical about the circus, the personality circus surrounding him. I would make a point though that what he did do in Belfast, what he did do for the art school in Belfast and for the art scene in Northern Ireland, I feel, is that he did inspire a certain group of students, a certain number of students. Those students went on to form Art and Research Exchange, which was a kind of version of its free international school. And they had premises in Belfast near the art school. And he was kind of presenting ideas which were to do with social engagement, and Art and Research Exchange started to act on those ideas. They also formed Circa magazine, which was the first really in-depth critical art magazine in Ireland, and it covered activities in the North and South. So even with the skepticism, I think, the legacy was very positive.
I think Maud, you found his visit at the time and in the context of the kind of the culture of the art college as kind of validating and very positive. But did you also see some of those, maybe those contradictions that John's talked about that were often, highlighted, and this phrase that Amanda brought up, unity and diversity? I mean, it's a wonderful sentiment, but it also seems to put maybe the expectation of the artist as a healer is a huge responsibility.
Yeah. Well, I found his physical presence itself, he was a very gentle man. I didn't find him threatening. I had expected to find him threatening. So the other thing is, I'll just tell you how I felt at the time. I was anxious about this block thing, and I thought he'd recognize me in some weird way as some sort of, because all my work was about energy, and I was interested in that kind of untamed aspect of Ireland. I knew exactly why I'd come to Ireland. In that sense, I knew that there were vestiges of what had been Eurasia, his great sort of mainstream reference, the Euro-Asian continent and the whole myth of that he was referencing this great power that somehow was still in Ireland, and I decided, instead of sort of facing him, I'd go 2 seats back and to the left. I felt that would be safe. So I was clearly very anxious, but thankfully I was too frightened to ask him a question, but that was because I was too young. But I didn't feel any contradiction in his person at all, because of the fact that he was in this integrative widening of language. He talked about it, the widening of language through drawing, as I found out later. But experiencing that widening of language into drawing, I was kind of intoxicating. I had never experienced anything like it. So I was carried by that energy. I didn't feel threatened. I didn't feel any contradiction. For me, it was a peace, absolutely an absolute peace. And and I think as well, though, the scale was with great respect. I mentioned a mentor of mine who was very anxious of boys coming and had read The Secret Block for a Secret Person in Ireland as a title. And while I was in America, he committed suicide. So there was, I found this out after boys had gone. He was very anxious about the title, that he felt he was going to be exposed. There was an interesting tension culturally in Ireland then. We were under pressure to mimic what was going on in Europe. We were being told, not by all our tutors, only by one, because we had fabulous tutors, but we were being told there was no such thing as Irish culture, but I mean, Beuys reaffirmed that kind of deep link, because he reached back into a kind of a Celtic sensibility, but that wasn't narrowly nationalistic. It was expansive. And he talked about energy, and Ireland was full of innate energy in the landscape, untouched. So it's a huge resource. It confirmed how I perceived things. It confirmed who I was. It gave me strength to be myself. And I had a strange reaction in the sense that I didn't seek him out after that for a while. I carried it with me. I got the poster. I visited the drawing, and that was my sort of stream of connection. I didn't become studious about him as an artist because I was afraid in case I'd get lost in him. He seemed like he just opened an orifice, a huge kind of stream within which you could get lost. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I felt I had to do my own thing, find my own way. That's too long an answer.
And John, I think, I mean, those student publications are fascinating, satirical, humorous, witty, but also that one of the pages you show, it does also encapsulate, it's a great document of the, I mean, there's a skepticism, but there's also seems to be a kind of respect as well within that, and it encapsulates the range of opinions that were expressed. In terms of his, or that event, in terms of its influence, or does it have a place in your ongoing thoughts or your ongoing, development as an artist?
Yeah, I think it did. Because I like his philosophy, but I'm not sure about his methodology. And he was espousing a kind of art for everyone. The fact that everyone can be an artist, and presumably that means that everyone can access, artistic practice as well. And yet I find his own work, the kind of esoteric drawing, weird performances, strange performances, which are accessible maybe to an art educated audience, but not so accessible to the greater public. And I think that problem became evident at the Ulster Museum, which is more of a general audience than there was at the art school. And some people kind of walked out of that. He could talk, he could talk, but he wasn't communicating to everyone, but he was talking. And I think for me, I really picked up on the notion that, yes, art can be about the everyday, for the everyday person, but how do you find ways, how do you find methods, how do you find a type of work that can be accessible to a broader public without dumbing down that work, and so that was what I moved forward with, to believing in kind of the possibility for greater access for contemporary art practice, but trying to find ways of making it connect with people's lives, or making you connect with what was going on outside that art school. You know, because when we went there, it was all about minimalism and abstraction. People were getting shot, blown up. You know, there was rioting in the streets, tit for tat killing. You know, how do you respond to that in terms of your artistic practice? So some people were saying, you know, that this man is just too much of a romantic. How can you apply those ideals to this circumstance? And then younger people at the art school started to make work about the Troubles. People like Brendan Ellis, John Kindness, Willie Doherty, Rita Duffy, you know, and you saw a kind of new wave of work, you know, coming from that place. And I think there might have been some kind of, you know, catalyst effect, I think, from that visit from Beuys.
Yeah.
And he, I think Beuys brought, I think, some of the Art Research Exchange Group to Documenter, so it maybe connected in with a kind of provided an opportunity to connect in with a kind of a wider sphere as well. Would welcome any comments or questions again from those listening for Maud or for John. So please just raise your hand or type in the chat box. How much, I wonder, it's interesting, I think, to the reception in Dublin, which is perhaps a little less documented, certainly less documented than in Belfast. But it seems very apparent the context of the two cities that you're living in, or were living in at the time, provided for the reception of his work.
Well, I'm not sure whether Beuys did 2 lectures or 1 lecture in Cork.
I think just 1 in Cork and 1 in Limerick.
One in Cork, really? Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, it for me, it was a huge kind of watershed in a sense, and it didn't have the same sort of. It was a much smaller group. Our lecture, a very small group. And we didn't have the full suite of drawings. We just had but that it had such an effect. I think it was really on the not so much on the political turbulence level, because I think his discussion, there wasn't a huge amount of discussion after the lecture, but the enduring kind of strange endurance of the event, and the absolutely the fact as well. I'm very interested in it as a process, because Beuys delivered this concept, but it was not just a moment. It created a kind of a continuum into the future as well, that the secret block remained a secret. It remained a continual unlocking of his work through his drawings. I feel that as, because he viewed his drawings as a generative source, and that block was there to be explored as a generative source. So I see it as something that he had a beautiful sense of continuity through his drawings as well, in terms of his ideas, as well as obviously the filmic. And he managed to find some quite, and of course installationally, mercurial ways forward, different sense of time and place. I think he's playing with time. He had a sort of ever-present kind of aspect in his work, where he kind of could pull atavistic references to the past and draw forward from a very ancient kind of knowledge into a tissue of engagement with the future through the medium of persona, a very integrative kind of process, and into the future. So I was this is something that's evolved in my work, which I now see why I was so attracted to Beuys, because he had something that I'm very desirous of and feel is incredibly relevant in terms of a new consciousness and finding a new form of integrative thinking with physical reality and taking responsibility for the environment and social issues. So I think he's still very relevant.
Victoria, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. well, first of all, Maud, I just applaud your way of your embodied knowledge and your way of speaking about the work is incredibly moving, and yeah, taking mental note of a number of your points there, because I too am interested in the legacies as they are, you know, relevant to the present and the future. But John, I wanted to come back to you because watching the film that you mentioned, I felt deeply uncomfortable because, you know, because of all the sort of issues of the amount of people who are parachuted into that context and then responded and kind of did their thing and then left, and you know, and I think what you say about Beuys, I mean, he actually did put funding into the early kind of formation of the, what wasn't that yet the Art and Research Exchange, was it? But what I suppose what I felt uncomfortable about was, you know, very much the sort of coming into a colonial kind of, or whatever, however you want to formulate it, a very difficult situation, and the kind of messianic quality that you talk about. But what struck me in that film is that some of the work that the artists were doing was so moving. And when I spoke to one of them, they said, well, what we were really annoyed about is that he didn't come to see us. You know, it was a kind of, you know, you have this invitation to when artists came to visit us, for them to sort of at least have a moment with us in our studios. But I think that was very much part of a security issue, and there were whole sort of difficult issues around access, and probably Beuys wanted maximum access from as many students who wanted to come. But when I watched the film again and saw him talk to the students directly, my discomfort was slightly allayed by his absolutely clear commitment for them to recognize their own power as shaping, you know, as people, as and their potential impact on a situation that seemed intractable and completely locked down. And although that may be incredibly naive, at the same time, the fact that he'd come through a particular historical situation himself and had seen the Nazi Zeit, it felt less disingenuous than it would had he not had that experience. But I really like what you presented, because it sums up that unease at the same time as admiration.
Yeah, but I don't think there's any doubting the man's sincerity.
Yeah.
But
the methodology.
There were communication difficulties, you know, just because of language, because of accent, and because of prior knowledge. You know, some people who were invited to the Ulster Museum were coming from community organizations who would have had no knowledge of who he was, where he was coming from, and just seeing him as a chancellor, you know, and the situation he was put into in the art school in Belfast was extraordinary. You know, they brought all of the students into the lobby, into the foyer, and he was in it was a very biblical, it was a scene of biblical proportions. You know, there were a couple of hundred young students there. Yeah, and he was kind of sitting at a desk, you know, down below, and we were all kind of gazing down upon him.
Yeah.
So but you're right, it was a very different connection when he was speaking to the smaller groups.
Yes. And one thing I would bring is that maybe the after effect quality of Beus's work, that sometimes I wonder whether some of those students who felt very huge reservations, as you say, you know, that they later kind of processed him. And I think this is what Maud's talking about, him using himself as a vehicle, you know, almost kind of processed him in retrospect, and that some of the ideas started to filter through. So I think that issue of maybe his impact happened to a point at the time, and some of it played out almost like fat seeping into a context.
Or honey seeping into a head.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. So I'm off.
Thanks, Victoria. Amanda had asked about what, just before we move on to Norman Rosenthal, Amanda had asked about if you had any thoughts on Beus's legacy on performance art practice on the island of Ireland. Is, if you feel you can comment on that area of his work.
I already said that its legacy had some effect. I mentioned a number of artists, but in terms of performance, I can see the influence in the work of Danny McCarthy. I can see it in the work of Andre Stitt, obviously in Amanda's work as well. But I think what Beuys did, or what his presence and his performance did, was give a license to certain types of work that hadn't really been very well regarded previously, and that would be performance and it would be social practice. I think he opened doors there in the art school, and consequently on a certain generation of young artists.
Yeah, I think as well, I'm interested in the fact that he opened the performative space, but I just had experience of him speaking, but that was in itself a sort of a hybrid condition that fascinated me. So it broke down a lot of the kind of art-specific boundaries, and I think that it allowed me to be able to understand and appreciate performance art as something that has a kind of a fluency and integrative kind of flow, which it's just counter to how we understand chronological time. I think that he kind of challenged that idea that there's a kairos as well. The Greeks call it kairos, which is a different kind of an opportunism. It's kind of where something flows from an opportunity. And I think Beuys has activated that stream, and the best of performance does that.
Yes, I'd like to agree with that, and say that I remember this from Caroline Tisdall, Bits and Pieces, and the energies, the Irish energies, the idea of making your secrets productive. Make your secrets productive. It's an energy. It's an energy. It's a form of energy within the creative imagination.
It's difficult for people to understand how compressed the 70s were in Ireland. How really, things weren't really moving ahead in the same way, and people were, sort of creative people were, and some of them were in really isolated positions with no access to a market, with no sense of a dynamic in infrastructure or practice. I mean, thankfully, people like Oliver Dowling recognized the opportunity and brought Beuys, but we were quite isolated back then. I mean, if the book wasn't in the library, you didn't have money to buy books. So, it was kind of, you sort of operated on your wits, Yeah, people forget.
Thanks, Maud. Thanks, John. We'll move on. But thank you both so much for your eloquent reflections on the possibilities, but also the complexities and of Beuys's visits and the legacy here. Thank you both again, and thanks to all the other questions and contributions from Jane and Victoria and others. We'll move on now to Norman Rosenthal, who is an eminent curator who was previously exhibitions secretary at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and there he organized the German Art in the 20th Century exhibition, but also, which included Joseph Beuys. He also worked on the Zeitgeist exhibition of contemporary art in Berlin in 1982, again, a major contribution from Beuys. And much earlier at the ICA, he organized Art into Society, Society into Art, 7 German Artists, which again, a very seminal piece was created by Beuys in that exhibition. So a long working relationship with Beuys, and then after Beuys's death in 1999, he exhibited The Secret Block for a Secret Person in Ireland, the drawing show that we've been discussing this morning. He showed that at the Royal Academy in 1999. So Norman, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
The only foreigner in this group.
Well,
I'm the non-Irish man. Huh?
well, I'm non-Irish too, so um, I thought I'd love to hear more about your kind of ongoing, your working relationship and through some of those exhibitions that I've just mentioned. But before the exhibition at the ICA that you did earlier that year, of course, and it's been touched on, of course, Jane earlier was talking about the Coyote Archive, and the name Coyote takes its name from Beuys's performance piece, I Like America and America Likes Me, which Maud has mentioned, I think maybe Amanda. But you saw that piece in New York in early 1974.
Yeah, I happened to be in New York at that time, and René Bloch had this gallery on West Broadway, I think certainly on the first floor, possibly on the second floor. And Beuys, he was basically there for 3 days, and he was like himself. He was like an animal. He presented himself like an animal, basically. He was the animal in the cage with the coyote. And he didn't speak to anybody. I knew him. I'd gotten to know him a year earlier, when I was preparing this exhibition with my friend Christos for the ICA in 1974, about which I've got a lot of stories to tell. But he was in New York, and I knew him. But of course, he didn't speak to a single person. He arrived in New York. Apparently, his feet never actually touched the ground. He was taken off the airplane, put into an ambulance, or a kind of an ambulance equivalent, and he was on a stretcher, and he was ferried to the René Bloch Gallery, where he stayed for 3 nights before he was taken away. Now, I'm not quite sure whether he went to a hotel at night. He might have well done. I think he probably did. But the effect was, the story was that he was in a cage with a coyote, confirming this. And, I want to read, John Carson, whom I don't know, but he brought up a very important word, which was romantic. And I want to read, if I may, this little phrase that I put at the head of an article that I wrote about Beuys a few years ago by the famous German author called Novalis. And Novalis wrote, basically in the 1810s or something, "I've heard that in ancient times beasts and trees and rocks conversed with men. And as I gaze upon them, they appear every moment about to speak to me. I can almost tell by their looks what they would say. There must be many words unknown to me. If I knew more, I could comprehend better. I formerly loved to dance. Now I think rather to the music." But Beuys was a kind of, he was a performer, of course, and he did want to kind of bring together. He was a romantic, and the question was that his question was, as it was for many German artists at that time, in the immediate, aftermath of the unspeakable horrors of what happened in World War II, not just to the Jews, but to just millions and millions of people in the whole of Eurasia. How was it still possible to be a romantic? And he tried to answer that question. I think that was one of the central things. But I mean, there were so many things about Beuys that one can say that, and he was very much the universe. He was attempting to be, in the way that Dürer was, in the way that Leonardo da Vinci was, to mention 2 artists, but also, Goethe and, great figures of German culture in the 19th century. He was a kind of, he aspired to something which, in this age of specialization, which is the universal man of knowledge, because he was incredibly knowledgeable about things like botany, for example, which comes out in The Secret Block, particularly also, but also about what I call the universal man in an age of specialization. And I think the artist when he said every man is an artist, he said what he really meant was every man should be an artist. And every man had the potential to be an artist. I think that's what he meant. And what do I say? I mean, he was a kind of exemplary figure. And he had, of course, his astonishing charisma. Of course, you can criticize him. You can criticize Michelangelo. You can say about the Last Judgment, it's a lot of naked men falling down the wall. But, art is a very complicated, ambiguous thing, which has a lot to do with context, which has a lot to do with knowledge, has a lot to do with culture, a lot to do with memory, all these things. And all these things were embedded in Joseph Beuys's work. And this idea of memory, too, is incredibly important. And that is something which is, in some ways, in this age of Wikipedia, is going away ever more. And, and he tried to embody ideas of memory, and, whether he actually was wrapped up in felt, whether he actually was, the myth is very important too. He made a myth around himself, and whether it's true or not is irrelevant. It was kind of sort of part of the performance, if you like.
Yeah, you mentioned his charisma, and I wanted to ask you. I have a few images, so I'll maybe share the screen just to show one or two of images from the exhibitions that you worked on. So, art into society, society into art, are kind of an exploration of the impact of capitalism in contemporary culture.
I went to Germany at that time. At that time, I was not very knowledgeable about what you might call contemporary art. I was much more involved maybe in the British art scene to some degree, and also in the world of old masters and so on. But nobody knew about Germany in those days. I mean, it was a kind, Europe was a kind of, particularly Germany, was a kind of terra incognita as far as art was concerned. But I went around Germany. At the time when Britain entered the European community, the ICA was given £10,000 or something by some, had a certain amount of money to do a festival of European art. And a year earlier, there'd been a French month. Because I speak German and spoke German at that time, somehow I was discovered and I was asked to take on organizing this month. And I went all the way around Germany, meeting lots and lots of artists and art personalities. And I alighted, from my perspective, on two, what I might call centers: the world around Joseph Beuys, and then the world around Baselitz. And because the ICA, which at that time seemed to me a very big space, was actually a very small space, I had to choose just one, and I chose Beuys as the figure, in the aftermath, particularly of the world of 1968, not that long beforehand, the world of the revolution, which also had relatively little impact in the Anglo-Saxon, even Irish world, compared to France and Italy and Germany and also the United States. I thought this was the most interesting thing to do, and we had this little conference in Berlin with all the artists, or most of the artists present. And I remember all of a sudden Wolf Vostell deciding not to participate because he was too jealous of Joseph Beuys, and then Joseph Beuys suggesting that we include Gustav Metzger in the exhibition as a German artist, which, he was had been on a Kindertransport, and he was very much part of the avant-garde in London at that time. And again, you have to remember, it was a tiny, tiny world. Anyway, Joseph said, would you bring me, all I want to do is engage with the public. All I need is 3 blackboards. And so I said, where do I get these blackboards? Blackboards with easels. And I sort of looked around. And in the end, I discovered this depot belonging to, the equivalent of the London County Council, basically their school department. And I found this kind of storage with hundreds of blackboards. And so I decided to take 100 blackboards to the ICA and put them in the storage room. And that's how this environment, which is called Richtskräfte, directive forces, happened. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of collaborative. And, Joseph would talk to whoever was there. Sometimes there were lots and lots of people there, and sometimes there were only 3 people there. It didn't really matter. He would arrive at 12 o'clock when the ICA opened, carrying his stick upside down, wearing his famous coat, and with a few, and he stayed there till 8 o'clock in the evening, with a few carrots and I don't know, sticks of celery in his pocket, which he would munch on from time to time. And when he finished a blackboard, he would lift it up like this and smash it onto the floor and make a big cymbal-like noise. And it, you know, there was a kind of musical element to the performance, and it was a performance. And then he would, you know, he said, "Would you go and get me some spray, you know, some to fit?" He got fixative, and he was very careful to fix the things. And I remember at one point of view, we ran out of money for expensive fixative, and so he said, "Go and get some hairspray." So I went out and bought, you know, lots and lots of tins of hairspray, and he would spray the blackboards each night, every morning before he left, and then when he left, you know, he was very conscious of these objects, you know, which were by the end of the exhibition, in order to go into the exhibition, you had to walk on the blackboards because they covered the entire floor. But he was very interested in restoring them.
So he was conscious.
Then the exhibition, you know, the blackboards became an environment, and then they went to the Venice Biennale, then they were shown in New York. And have I got it right? I mean, maybe, and then they were bought by the National Gallery, you know, they were bought by the National Gallery where in Berlin, where you can still see them today. And occasionally they get lent.
So he was conscious even during, though they may appear like something that's in the moment, that is a trace of a performance, he was conscious of it becoming an artwork, of making that transformation from kind of action to object.
Joseph Beuys, to me, as Maud just said, is one of the most extraordinary draftsmen of the post-war period, you know, because he invested not Botticelli, I'm sorry, I could mention Botticelli and his amazing drawings that he did for Dante, which we also showed at the Royal Academy, but that's another story, sorry about that. But he was a kind of Leonardo-like figure, you know, and like Leonardo, he found it quite difficult to finish things too, do you know what I mean? And also Dürer too, you know, there are relatively few painters. Dürer, who was a great painter, but he didn't paint very much, you know, and because he was just interested in the entire world and what I might call the entire realm of knowledge, and and which I'm afraid is, you know, in the end is a very important thing, to know, somehow to know about everything. And, you know, I've been very fortunate to meet a person like that, because, you know, and to be involved with a person like that. The other thing that I think one tends to forget about, that nobody has mentioned, is, like all great artists, he had an amazing erotic charge within his art too. And his drawings of women, but also kind of, you know, figures, have an amazing eroticism to them as well. And that should not be forgotten. And that is a kind of thing that goes right through his art, in my opinion, as well. People tend to forget when they're talking about him.
And I guess that's another kind of form of energy. And was that embodied, I mean, that eroticism in his performance and his physical presence?
Yes,
you say?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think, you know, like, it's like, you know, I mean, there was definitely the star about him, you know, what you might call, you know, in the sense that all art is at one level a form of entertainment in a positive sense. Some of, you know, I think artists nowadays particularly tend to forget what I call you know, it's about, you know, art is also about entertainment. Do you know what I mean? But entertainment is a good thing, you know, and there's good entertainment and bad entertainment. There's cheap and nasty and vulgar entertainment, and there's very sophisticated entertainment. And as far as I'm concerned, Beethoven is entertainment, you know.
Can I ask, you mentioned...
and I would put Beuys on that kind of level as an artist, you know, I mean, he had a universalism to him, which I thought was very beautiful and very important, and certainly changed my life and my attitude to art and to culture in general. And by the way, one of the most beautiful things, you know, when he did that wonderful piece called Plight, which is now in the Pompidou Center, that great environment which he did, you know, one of the last great things he did, that great felt environment. The poster was, in fact, the poster for that was of the, I think it's called the Giant's Causeway, am I right?
Yeah.
Is that it? I can't never.
That's
Sorry,
it, yeah,
so
that's
boring.
it.
Is it in Northern? Is the Giant's Causeway is in Northern Ireland or not?
It is, yeah, up on the coast,
That's
north
what I
coast.
thought. Yeah. Well, you know, it is the Giant's Causeway. But you know, he gave me a poster, which is one of my most precious possessions, is the poster that he inscribed for me, where he wrote, you know, for Norman, from Joseph, with love forever and ever. And
And the Giant's Causeway.
you know, he was a person, and you know, when I read it, I sort of feel that kind of almost erotic charge to it, you know, in the way that he wrote. His handwriting was also very beautiful, kind of old-fashioned German handwriting, and it had its sort of own flowing aspect. And you know, you can see these drawings down there at the bottom at the ICA. They are basically drawings, and you know, funnily enough, I discovered relatively recently that he took the idea of the blackboard from his student Jörg Immendorf, who did blackboards as works of art before him.
Okay, and he talked about when he wrote his name, he was effectively drawing. So yeah, writing as a kind of a form of drawing.
Yeah.
You mentioned when you went to Berlin in researching the Art and Society show that German art was kind of terra incognita at the time in Britain. Was there any, I mean,
and in America too, of course.
Also
in America, it has changed very quickly between the early mid-70s and the end of the decade. But you know, in those days, everybody in America and everybody in Britain thought there was only one thing: American art with a little bit of art in London. That was all there was, you know.
And you mentioned, obviously, it's only a few decades after the kind of trauma and horrors of World War II. Was there any reticence or tension or pushback in terms of showing German art then and showing Beuys? And of course, he'd fought in the Luftwaffe and at the time in the 70s, because those issues have resurfaced, I think, in the last year.
There was more resistance when I came to the Royal Academy 4 or 5 years later to showing Baselitz, Kiefer, Richter, Polka than there was to showing Beuys. Because again, you know, Beuys looks, you know, it had, you know, at that time, conceptual art was beginning to be accepted, you know what I mean? And one understood, and Hans Harker, by the way, who was one of the artists in the exhibition, showing his famous piece about the asparagus, you know what I mean? He was also present, and so that was more acceptable. This world was more acceptable, this kind of conceptual art world. And by this time, people like Gilbert and George and Richard Long were already showing in Dusseldorf with René Bloch, etc., etc. So there was, you know, that was beginning. And later, the real big row came over, you know, the world of Baselitz and Kiefer and all those other artists. That was really a threat, because English art at that time was very much a painting culture. It was the painting culture, you know, pop art and what you might call abstract expressionist art in England. Yeah. That kind of universal language. And what I tried to find, I thought that you know, that was the culture of art as it was known at the time, either pop or what you might call the English version of abstract expressionism. I don't know if that all makes sense. You know, it's all about context in the end. Art takes place in a context, and now the context has got hugely bigger. You know, now the whole world embraces something called contemporary art, to the extent that it's impossible to know what's going on everywhere. You know, you cannot, you know, you can find conceptual art now in Saudi Arabia. Do you know what I mean? Everywhere. There's no way where you cannot find it, and the people are trying to make an impact. I say this because I once saw an exhibition, perfectly decent, of Saudi Arabian conceptual art, you know, but, you know, kind of post-Beuysian, if you like.
Yeah, you've spoken a bit about his body and physical presence. Can I ask about, in terms of your experience of working with him and his approach to materials as well? and very often, you know, symbolic. I'm thinking of the Zeitgeist exhibition that you worked on in Berlin, and his
Zeitgeist exhibition was actually supposed to was a kind of a Baroque version of an exhibition I'd done, that Baselitz exhibition I'd done a year earlier in at the Royal Academy. I'd done with my friend Christos at the Royal Academy. We curated it together. I always like to curate with at least one other person, because I find conversation is very important when you're curating. And I think if you try and do it by yourself, you get rather paranoid. But anyway, we had this huge space, as you see, in the middle to fill, and you can hardly fill that with painting, you know. So all the way around the walls, there were paintings, you know what I mean, around those little, in those colonnades and in all the galleries around. It was, you know, the Baroque version of the exhibition I'd done a year earlier. And so we went to see Joseph, Christos and I, we went to see him in Düsseldorf, and then he came to Berlin, and he walked around this extraordinary building, which was unknown. It had, you know, the Martin Gropius-Bau had only just recently reopened a year earlier, and it was situated right on the Berlin Wall, which was still running past it, literally out of one of the windows. You know, it was literally on the Berlin Wall. You know, you could see across to the other side. And actually, I remember at the time, because, you know, as a Brit, I was able to go to East Germany, and I actually went to see somebody in the ministry, and I said, could we even open the door, because there was all this graffiti in East Germany, in East Berlin at the time about the Zeitgeist exhibition. And of course, the people in East Berlin were unable to see it. So I made a formal application. I wish I had the documents about it, but they must lie there somewhere, probably in the Stasi archives. As it were, close the Zeitgeist exhibition for one day and open the Martin Gropius-Bau so that people could cross over and go into it. And, you know, they listened to me very respectfully, and but of course it never happened. Anyway, there we are. That was kind of a funny moment. But Beuys made this amazing one. He said, I will bring my studio. And that's what he did. He emptied his studio in Düsseldorf and brought all the contents of his studio to Berlin. And in the middle of it, he built this rather extraordinary mound, which is very suggestive. You know, he came to Ireland, but, you know, I'm speaking to you from Suffolk. And I dare say if he'd been to Sutton Hoo, he would have loved that too. Do you know what I mean? So there's a sense of burial as well. And he talks about that, you know, when he, you know, there's this, it's about, you know, the gathering of, you know, he wrote that, you know, this is where what Novalis talks about. It's about the animals gathering with the humans around, you know, as they must have done, you know, 3,000 years ago on the steppes of Eurasia, or indeed in Ireland, or indeed at Sutton Hoo.
As Maud was saying, you're always tapping into those ancient and those ancient kind of legacies and traces.
Yeah.
And the Giant's Causeway is a link, of course, to Scotland, a kind of geological link, and back across through Europe and the Celtic world. I'd like to kind of open it up a bit more to conversation in a minute or two. And so if again people have questions, raise your hand.
Can you see those little well, basically those things that look like turds?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, what they are the tools of his studio, hammers and screwdrivers and I don't know what else. You know what I mean? Wrapped in clay.
Okay.
And that's, you know, that was again, you know, a kind of an imaginative, you know, part of the imaginary world that he invented for himself. And of course, you know, artists exist. You know, there was obviously the public voice, but there was also the private voice. And, you know, they come together, you know, each great artist for sure, has his own mythological private world that he wants, you know, he's also making art. Artists do art for themselves as well as for a public. And, you know, I think Beuys is exactly the same. I mean, he was looking into himself, looking into his knowledge, and looking into his own pain as well. And I think the pain that he had. It wasn't his fault that he was born in 1927. It wasn't his fault that I even imagine if I were to cut, if I were very carefully to examine Leni Riefenstahl's films of the Nuremberg marches, I might find him, somewhere buried in there, marching at the Nuremberg rallies, he was a prisoner too. We're all prisoners of our time. Some of us are lucky prisoners. I've been a lucky prisoner. My parents, who were emigres, which is why I speak German, were in some ways was less than lucky. Let's put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Though they survived, at least. By
And
the skin of their teeth, by the way.
And how do you, when you look back on Beuys's work today, and we sort of touched on this, and I wanted to ask you about his relevance, and I guess that has been a lot of the drive of the centenary year, reevaluating, and this myth, the personal myth that he created, his teaching.
Great artists of the past are always relevant. Great artists of the past, as far as I'm concerned, I can only speak for myself, but Dürer is relevant, Poussin is relevant, Cézanne is relevant, and Beuys is relevant, and of course they are inevitably prisoners of the epoch that they lived in. And I don't know whether we learn from them, but I mean, whether there are in amongst them thousands of artists, those, I don't know which ones of today will survive in the universal discussion. Time alone will tell, but there's no question that Beuys survives as an artist. The mere fact that we're talking about him today suggests that he means something, and even if it's not a question, art is not about liking or not liking, or criticizing or not criticizing. The question is the level on which he operated, and he operated at a very high level of knowledge and skill and hand as well. His drawings are staggeringly beautiful. I'd give anything to own a drawing by Joseph Beuys. You know what I mean? Because they speak of the totality too. Each drawing, as Maud suggests, speaks of an extraordinary a universal totality, of human knowledge, and as do his sculptures and as do his actions. But of course, there is the sense of the relic, and the relic has its own beauty too, as one knows from, I don't need to tell you Irish Catholics about the importance of relics, whether they're true or not is irrelevant, whether it's the bone of Christ or that was, some little piece of wood taken off the cross, whether it really is or whether it isn't. It is the fact whether you can believe it or not. And art is about, of course, like religion, is about belief. You want to believe. If you want to believe, I don't know whether you guys will agree with me, but there is a relationship of art and religion insofar as we're in both are dealing with worlds which at a certain level have an irrationality to, whatever realism is, or whatever the real world is, none of which we really know anyway. Are we really dreaming, or are we dreaming that we're alive, or are we actually alive in this weird universe?
We use art and religion, but I think to find our way in the world, and to find our place and our relationship to the world.
Of course,
and there was in your essay
thing about Beuys was beautiful. Some people didn't like it. You know what I mean? People think that art should be, but whatever you say about Malevich, you know what I mean? In the end, he was painting icons. His black square was so beloved by the world of, I don't know, the world of Beuys's critics, in America, Rosalind Krauss and all that kind of thing, is ultimately an icon, a religious icon, and nothing else.
Your Royal Academy essay from the 1999 catalogue, you quoted Beuys as talking about his work as a process of experiment towards experience, which I thought was a nice way of
say that again. What did I say?
Well, you quoted Beuys as saying that his work was a process of experiment towards experience, which I thought was a nice way of kind of sort of encapsulating some of that those ideas about how we use art and how art can enable us to.
Yeah, I mean, the whole of life is an experiment, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
You know, every day is a new experiment, and every day you're alive, and then one day I suppose you will no longer be. I don't know what happens on the other side. Everything or nothing. Huh? Probably nothing, but I think artists have a way of, you know, somehow, you know, in the end, artists do have a technique for, and certainly great artists have, you know, a lot of sins are committed in the name of art, of course, but great artists, I don't know what that is, but I wouldn't like to have to define it, but I like to think I know it when I see it, you know, and for me, Joseph Beuys is a great artist.
I'd love to open it up. I'm sure there are questions, comments, discussion. Maud.
It's wonderful to hear you speak. I just really enjoyed it. But what I wanted to ask you about was this idea of thinking being released by death. I had this great feeling of a great grief as well in Beuys's work. And I was thankful to you for pointing out that he had nurtured his tools by wrapping them in clay. In some way, the burial was also a kind of a process of caring and protection, but also burial. So I was just interested in that transition between life and death, and how there is one beautiful drawing where he shows himself lying down, sort of almost amalgamated with a stag, which was always something that was.
If you know that piece, Palazzo Regale, which is now in Düsseldorf, where his very last work, you know, he kind of buries himself.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, some people will think it's a good idea, some people not. I think it's very beautiful, like a kind of Egyptian pharaoh, basically, you know, in a kind of modern version of an Egyptian pharaoh. He puts his he puts his famous coat into one of those, along with the symbols, by the way, I think was a pair of symbols in a vitrine, and these vitrines have, you know, this kind of museum-like quality. You know, they're sort of embedded in the vitrine, and you know, you feel he's burying himself, or he has been buried, and he was to die very shortly afterwards. And we just done this exhibition where for the first time we showed the piece called Blitzschlag, you know, which I think I sent you a photograph of that. We'd shown that at the Royal Academy. We couldn't show it the show went to Stuttgart, but we couldn't show it in James Sterling's building because none of the galleries were high enough to show the work. So Beuys, in fact, was making a work of art. I'm just trying to remember what it was called, but it was one of a felt work, and he was there we are. Huh? You can only see half of it. It's cut off here, okay? But it goes right up into a big top. Okay, there we are. That's a better view, a less good photograph, but a better view of it, you know. And that was the work that we had at was shown at the Royal Academy, complete with that beam across. You know, somehow I managed to persuade, I don't know how, the Royal Academy to do that. I remember Margaret Thatcher coming to the exhibition with Helmut Kohl, and Helmut Kohl saying to Margaret Thatcher, "Look, Joseph Beuys, famous German artist." That was kind of memorable little, she looked very bemused, you know what I mean? And I don't think she was convinced. But by this time, Beuys was still alive, and then he died. He'd gone back to Germany having installed this, and then a few weeks later, he died whilst we were installing the show in Stuttgart, which was a kind of amazing survey of German art with a catalogue, which unfortunately I think is, you know, you should try and look at it. It's not a bad catalogue as a history of 20th century German art, even though there was a lot to come. The 20th century was not over at that time completely. But that's another whole discussion. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not talking too much about myself, but you know, it was a great privilege to have engaged with this great artist, you know, on specific projects, the ICA project, the Zeitgeist project, of course, and then, of course, in this exhibition, German Art of the 20th Century, where I think, he was presented in the center of the, in that round central hall of the Royal Academy, which some of you may know.
No, it's great to have that personal first-hand account, and I guess that's really been the kind of theme of the morning, in some ways. Victoria, you've another question or comment.
Hello there, Norman. I have to just say before I start that it's one of the abiding professional regrets of my life that I was very beautifully invited to meet yourself, Carolyn, and Anthony Gormley at Thaddeus Ropac, and missed the email which went into my junk folder. I will eternally.
No, there's lots of time to meet. You're a young girl, and I'm not quite dead yet, I hope. Even though I'm 77.
I think what's really speaking to me, I mean, what a wonderful talk, and really, grateful for you for sharing it. And what's really speaking to me is the implications of this work for the present. I think we have now a lot of more theory that helps us understand how Beuys was working, and looking at the work. Just to quickly finish, because it's more of a, just an observation from what you said, that the Zeitgeist exhibition being so near the border with East Germany, and seeing that Silbury Hill-like mound right in the middle,
literally on the border. I mean, you could touch the wall, the famous Berlin Wall, from the building.
Yes. And to me, I don't know about other people, but that is, he's not resurrecting an ancient past in a fixed way, is he? It's sort of like, look at these other cultures, at how they work with energy. You can rebuild, you can, find the hero in yourself, or heroine in yourself. Do you know what I mean? It's like they're a provocation on so many levels. I just found that really, I had no idea that work was placed in that particular context. So he's drawing from ancient cultures, but at the same time, it's incredibly
even from the cave paintings. You know what I mean? From the world of the cave paintings, from Lascaux and so on. You feel the continuity of humankind in his work, which you do, as I say, in all art, in all great art.
Wonderful. And given sort of reading a lot of sort of thinkers and artists and philosophers sort of saying, in relation to our current climate context, sorry to bring that elephant into the room, it's the move to kind of move away from this kind of toxic way of living is going to come from a kind of spiritual, a mass movement. It's probably not going to come from political parties. It does feel like Beuys's way of stimulating people and pressing for energy and kind of provoking.
We haven't mentioned the Green Party, for example, his role in founding the Green Party, and his real concern for what you might call the environment. I mean, he really did have a concern for the green world around us. But I can think of other artists of that time who did it in different ways. You know what I mean? But he certainly had his own language to discuss. He found his own language, his own mythological language, or his mythological metaphors. Is that a reasonable to bring such subjects to attention? And he had his party and his university and his all that. So. Yeah, of course he was he had the shaman aspect to him, but he also had this kind of, he was very interested in practical solutions, and he had his own economic theory, you know what I mean, which maybe this economic theory that in a way it is that I think we haven't talked about that, what he had a theory of economy, okay, which I think is also worth discussing and bringing up, and understanding that it's through creative energy that through creativity, that the human individual creativity, that the human economy needs to work, and artistic economy needs to work. And they were both the same, you know. He made no difference between art and the everyday, you know. If you know, sweeping the streets or making jam, you know, was also a creative act, you know. Making a beautiful pot of jam was also a creative act. And, you know, not less, you know, obviously he was an artist and he was engaged with the art market. Actually, he had, until just before the last maybe 10 years of his life, but he had really he was not very good at marketing himself in terms of the art market. But that's another whole story.
But great at, I guess, marketing himself or promoting or projecting a kind of a persona,
Yeah,
a
and
performance.
He was like Caroline. Caroline was you know, who was one of the leading, at that time, a leading art critic in London. You know, she was art critic of The Guardian. She was an art historian. She was an expert on futurism and so on and so forth. And she was, you know, she wrote, and she was a great, you know, she was a great, what is it, you know, proselytizer for Beuys. And, you know, I was privileged to, at certain moments, to be the same. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just for moments, because I never, you know, at least speaking for myself, I like to work with artists when I can do something for them, and then I go away again. You know what I mean? And do something else. But, you know, we all lead our lives.
We're coming up to 1 o'clock, so that maybe that point about bringing creativity into our own lives, into the everyday, is a nice moment to finish on.
I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Unless anyone has a final kind of burning comment or question for on the day, jump in now. But if not, I'd just like to thank Norman Rosenthal, Jane Whitaker, John Carson, Amanda Coogan, Maud Cotter, and everyone who's contributed today for really.
And Amanda's performance was really beautiful. I think we all need to applaud that, because it really did have this. I thought the spirit of Beuys came through her very beautifully. And it's through that kind of thing that Joseph Beuys will continue to live.
I really appreciate. Thank you very much. But I have to say, I've just been scribbling wildly notes during your talk there, Norman. Thank you very much.
I hope we meet one day.
Such a great insight.
We might meet. Okay.
Please God. Please God.
Okay, I'm sure Logan can pass you an email for me. Okay.
Brilliant.
Take care.
It's a shame. It would be nice to kind of in other times, you know, you could go away and have a cup of coffee or food or drink and kind of share in a more convivial way, but rather than a kind of a, you know, leave meeting, push a button and you're gone. But thank you, Norman, so much for sharing your insights into working with Beuys. It's been really fascinating. Barbara.
Logan, can I just, before everybody goes, thank you very much for chairing this. It was wonderful. Jessica and her team, and to all the contributors, it was really a wonderful morning. Norman, you finished, you don't disappoint. It was absolutely revelatory at the end to talk to us about Joseph Beuys, the artist, but also the man, and the relationship between you and the artist. I think we all found that marvelous, as we did with all of the contributors, Maud, Amanda, John, and Jane. Now, I do hope that as these restrictions lift and this dreaded virus or pandemic recedes, that we might get you back in person sometime, particularly Norman, who couldn't travel to Dublin today, and maybe the others as well. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll see you in person at some stage.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And I'll just remind you that our exhibition continues until the 24th of April as well. So if you can make it to Dublin, come and see the show. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and your contributions this morning.
Thank you. Thanks a million.
I'm from Suffolk. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Logan.